So it's good to see everyone. Um, so this is I'm getting a strange sign with a music note. Ira, that's okay. Just okay.
Everything
All right.
looks good.
Okay. Cool. So everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us. And what I would like to do is make a presentation, but also open it up for conversation. This is sort of an impromptu lecture that is we did one on Tuesday and now one today. And it's really as a response to the explosion of anti-Semitism throughout the world in light of or in the aftermath of the Hamas-Israel war or ongoing war, low-intensity war, and the global reaction to it, which we saw an explosion of anti-Semitic rhetoric in the media of record, among intellectuals, and I would say, in a sense, the shock troops, the Students for Justice in Palestine, young, marginalized Muslim people in North America and in Europe going out and physically looking for Jewish people to attack. So, physical attacks. And the thing about these physical attacks, as we all know, I'm sure everybody here knows, is that unlike physical attacks against any other group, which must be and always be loudly discouraged and condemned at the highest levels, we know that when it came to this outbreak in anti-Semitism, people in the human rights community and other communities that usually stand up against hate were significantly silent. And I found this to be, as I'm sure many of you also, perhaps the most disturbing part about this. And I think it, I remember the quote by Martin Luther King where he said something to the effect, I'm not going to be as eloquent as him, but he said something to the effect that he's not so concerned about the actions of the few bad people, but he was more concerned and worried about the inaction of the vast majority of good and decent people. And we're living in a time where the vast majority of good and decent people, for reasons which I'll try to unpack, are remaining silent in this explosion of anti Semitism, the legitimization of anti Semitic rhetoric and even physical violence. And physical violence in the most important democratic countries of the world, which should not be lost on any of us. So the title of my talk that is If Israel is an Apartheid State and the Jewish are white elitists, what next? And trying to look at issues of globalization and structural shifts in power, in politics, in economics, and in culture that is facilitating and encouraging these trends. So, first of all, I would like to start that the IRA definition on anti Semitism is very important. It clearly stipulates that blaming Jews for the actions of Israel or lumping the Jewish people to the actions of a government of Israel is a form of anti Semitism. So, the media coverage, the physical violence is clearly uh, forms of recognized anti Semitism. More than 60 countries have accepted this definition. Hundreds of municipalities around the world have accepted this definition of anti Semitism. Hundreds of universities have also accepted it. So it's important. And those of you who are following the debate between the Jerusalem Declaration and the IRA definition, if if anything is learnt from the last few weeks of this explosion of anti Semitism, we have to know that the Jerusalem definition is deficient, fundamentally deficient, because according to this definition, the attacks on Jewish people in New York, in Los Angeles, in Montreal, Toronto, Paris, Oxford, London, Belgium, the list goes on, that according to the Jerusalem Declaration, the hunting down and singling out of Jews for attack in wake of the war between Israel and Hamas would not be considered the reason for the anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish people. So this definition that is being circulated by progressive, in quotations, intellectuals is deeply flawed. The correlation between anti-Semitism, classical forms of anti-Semitism, and what in my work we called Israel bashing, there's a strong correlation. I did work with Ed Kaplan in 2005, and it was the first research that showed the correlation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism or Israel bashing. We did a study in which we interviewed 10,000 people in Europe, and we looked at levels of anti-Semitism and levels of Israel bashers. And in our study, we discovered that people who are Israel bashers are 13 times more likely than the average population to be anti-Semitic. So the correlation is powerful. And anybody who tries to break the correlation or ignore the correlation or make excuses for it is not telling the truth, scientifically not telling the truth. The correlation is very strong and very clear. And we see this. We did the study in 2005, and in 2021, unfortunately, the social reality is clear. There is a correlation. So, as you know, Jews are being classified, particularly in the United States, as white, as the epitome of white colonial racism and racists. Israel is being targeted and labeled as an apartheid state. And this has come out of not only the BDS movement, but it comes out of intellectual, social theory and discourse for the past 40 odd years. And this discourse is not only taking hold in the university, but it's now going wider and entering into or penetrating into society. And unfortunately, I have to say this with all due respect, our community, which has survived because of knowledge, because of the Torah, because of studying and learning and the wisdom in our heritage and in our culture, we are a people that understands the importance and the significance of education. And our community has fallen asleep, as Martin Luther King referred to, sleeping through the revolution. We've been sleeping through a revolution. And we have ceded the university to our enemies, not to intellectuals with different opinions and different perspectives and a different worldview or a different ideology, but we have surrendered the university to our enemies. The people launching the war against the Jewish people started in our universities. And for our community to ignore it, it's ignoring the best part of our heritage, and it's ignoring the fact that the university is perhaps the most important institution in any society, in particular in democratic societies, because this is where young people learn to become citizens. It's a place where young people learn the values of the society. And ladies and gentlemen, at our finest universities in the United States of America, in Canada, and in Western Europe, the prevailing philosophical discourse at this moment inherently, consistently, not only demonizes Israel and delegitimizes Israel, it also delegitimizes and dehumanizes who the Jewish people are in the diaspora. And for too long, and this discourse still goes on in our community, particularly in the United States of America, somehow the good Jews are going to distance themselves from Israel. But when the thugs go looking for Jews in Jewish neighborhoods of New York or Los Angeles or in Miami or in Montreal or in Toronto, they don't distinguish between the good and bad Jews. And they don't make a distinction between Israel and Jewish communities in the diaspora. And the reason why our synagogues and our schools and our institutions require physical security today is because the connection between our community and Israel is strong. It's strong from a Jewish perspective, and it is strong, this connection is strong amongst the ideology of our enemies. And if the Jewish community support the apartheid regime, in quotations, in Israel, then synagogues and Jewish student organizations are an enemy of democracy. So this is what's at stake. So this distinction between right-wing Jews and left-wing Jews and Jews who are in Israel or Jews who support Israel, and with assimilationist Jews or diaspora Jews, these distinctions really need to stop. And we need to understand what's at risk for all Jewish people in Israel, in Europe, in North America, and throughout the diaspora. So now, if Israel is an apartheid state, a racist colonial state, what's at stake here, from a liberal human rights perspective, is the future of Israel, is the future of the Jewish people. Because from a liberal human rights perspective, if Israel is an apartheid state, we would be morally and legally obligated to dismantle it. And I want to repeat that. If Israel is an apartheid state, we would be morally and legally obligated to ensure its dismantling. And the BDS movement, the shock troops, and the intellectuals behind this perception, this twisted perception, this revisionist perception filled with deep lies, this is their agenda. And the fact that these ideas are gaining traction in Congress, in Senate, in the Democratic Party, even in Jewish institutions in the United States of America, let alone the media of record and universities, is a lie with traction, and it's a dangerous lie. Edward Said, I said this the other day in my lecture, Edward Said famously said that he was the last Jewish intellectual, that he was the inheritor, the inheritor of the work of Adorno and Horkheimer, that he was the inheritor of the witnesses to the Shoah, that he took on the mantelpiece of being the inheritor of the wisdom and the struggle against fascism and Nazism, and that he was the last authentic Jewish intellectual. And he famously wrote that the Jewish intellectuals live in the suburbs of America and that they forgot their cause and their condition. So speak about forms of anti-Semitism. Inherent in this statement, the chutzpah that he has to write this is unbelievable. The fact that it has now been accepted widely among intellectuals is staggering. But what chutzpah to say it. But talk about anti-Semitism. Talk about the Christian notion of the replacement theory, that he is the authentic Jew, and we know the legacy of anti-Semitism in Christianity as that they took over the covenant and they were the authentic inheritors of the covenant with God and the Jewish people and the land. Replacement theory and a sophisticated form of Holocaust revisionism. The flipping of the fact that the Jews were not the victims of the Nazis, but the Palestinians are, and Said is the intellectual, the messiah of the Palestinian cause and of postmodernity, and he's the authentic Jew. Last week we had a session with an amazing woman, Mrs. Landau. Mrs. Landau is a Holocaust survivor from Poland, and she addressed a small group of us at ISGAP. And she explained how in her life she was a child in Lodz, and she was put into a ghetto with her mother, her father, a brother, and a sister. And they escaped the ghetto and they went into the forest. The mother was separated from the family, and she was alone with a brother, a sister, and her father. Her brother died of starvation in the arms of her father. They lived on eating worms and leaves, whatever they can find, barks from a tree. And to make a long, important story short, they, on the verge of starvation, on the verge of death, they were marched to a pit, and they were on the edge of the pit, and the Nazis shot the Jewish people from the forest. They rounded them up in the forest, shot them in the pit. We know all these horrific stories from the Shoah. And her father shielded her from the execution, the firing squads, and she fell into the pit and she survived. And she crawled out of the pit through the bodies of the people that were executed. She kissed her father and survived, and her sister, goodbye, and she crawled to a farm, and fortunately, righteous Gentiles nurtured her back to life, back to health. And to make a long story short, she was reunited with her mother. They eventually went to Israel. She's now a grandmother of 7. She has 7 grandchildren. She had 3 children. And at the end of her conversation with us, she said that the fact that she survived, that her survival was a defeat for the Nazis, because the Nazis wanted to exterminate the inferior race, the Jewish people that were polluting the purity of the white Aryan race. And the fact that she survived was a victory. The fact that she had 3 children was a victory over the racist Nazis. And the fact that she had 7 grandchildren was her victory over the racist Nazis. So imagine a woman that is living today in 2021 who survived the Shoah, who witnessed the extermination of Jewish people because they were the wrong race, that she's sitting today in Israel and she's watching and listening to the discourse on race. And in the United States of America, there's this conversation that political activists are having. Some of them, not all of them. Some of them are in the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of them are in the BDS movement. But terrifyingly, many of them are professors at our best universities in the world, teaching that Jews are the epitome of white elitist colonial apartheid racists. So they're not saying Jews are white, sorry for your extermination, sorry for the annihilation of 6 million souls, sorry for the destruction of European Jewish civilization, sorry for the fact that the Jews of North America and of Israel, many of which escaped with their lives as refugees, sorry for the racism of the past, and now welcome to the club and you're white. I mean, that's problematic in and of itself, but it could be a nice liberal gesture. But no, what's happening in the discourse now, despite the extermination that the Jewish people weren't white not very long ago historically, now Jewish people are being defined as the epitome of white European colonialism and racism, which dominated the world for centuries. So as the Europeans went off to colonize the world, we know that the Jews were being expelled and forcibly converted and murdered in Europe as Europe was rising to go and colonize the world. And colonize the world with science and theology and philosophy that created a hierarchy of races. The whites were at the top, Africans were at the bottom, and the Jews were the dangerous ones that had to be eliminated. So imagine centuries of colonialism that justified the invasion of Africa, the Americas, Asia, the world. At some point in the world, Europe controlled over 85% of the land mass of the world. In Canada, they're still digging up graves of indigenous children that were forcibly converted and put into Christian schools and abused sexually and murdered by Christian thinkers. I was not too long ago in Ghana, where the forts of no return, where they would take Africans and put them into these military compounds before they were exported to the Americas as slaves. And the thing that shocked me in this very moving space was not only the place, how the African slaves were held and in the conditions that they were held, but on top of these pits and pens in which they would put human beings into, and before they would go for slavery, on the top of these spaces where people were dying of starvation and dying of dehydration, on top there were churches. You can hear from the bottom, underneath the churches, you can hear the people suffering as these European Christians were praying to God. Imagine the dehumanization of racism, of true racism. In Newfoundland, this is part of my research when I was a student, in Newfoundland, the British had chutzpah Newfoundland. There were indigenous people in Newfoundland. They were called the Biotic people. For 132 years, the British, and I'm sitting here in Oxford, the British hunted the Biotic people, and the last person, her name was Sawandowit. Sawandowit died in 1878, and she was the last Biotic person on the planet. They were completely wiped out by the British. And histories of colonialism in the Americas and Africa is fraught with genocide and slavery. Germany sort of apologized last week for the genocide in Namibia. A genocide in Namibia which had a direct bearing on the Holocaust because young German soldiers were trained in Namibia and went back to Germany to become leading SS officers and played a crucial role in the final solution when it came to the Jewish people. So speaking about racism and the destruction globally of these ideas that were rooted in theology, that were rooted in science, eugenics, and all of these twisted ideas, and in the social sciences. It was only in the 1950s in the United States of America where leading historians, most of them coming out of Yale, made the connection between racism and slavery. Until the 1950s in the American Academy, they didn't learn. Students were not taught that slavery was inherently racist. Imagine, it only was in the 1950s that curriculum began to change in the United States of America, where people started to make the connection between racism and slavery, between racism and segregation, economic, social, and political segregation. So now the Jews, who were victims of this dominant ideology, rooted in theology, rooted in science, rooted in the social sciences, rooted in economics and politics and culture. The Jews who were exterminated 3 generations ago are now being defined by white liberal progressives as the epitome of being white, elitist, racist, supporting an apartheid system. It's staggering, but it's important to understand that in the universities, at the best universities, this is what's being taught. My colleague, I think who's on the call, Chloe Pinto, was saying that at Cambridge University, for example, university students at Cambridge have to sit and write final papers, and final papers are now, as of last year, include the work of Edward Said, and students have to write about the problematic Zionist entity as a final paper at Cambridge. So here we have, for 2 generations, professors of the highest order twisting the history of Israel based on the work of Michel Foucault and Edward Said, 2 people who were proponents of the Iranian Revolution, as a footnote to this, supporters of the Iranian Revolution, thinking that the Iranian Revolution would be akin to what the French Revolution was to France, an enlightenment and democracy. The Iranian Revolution was going to be to the Islamic world. These are the people who are some of the most important thinkers that young people learn about. So I would like to say a few more things and open up for conversation. I think an important aspect of cultural identity is the capacity for a group to define itself. And if Jews have power in the United States of America, we have to assert our power and at the very least define who we are. So we know we're not the Semitic race that's polluting the purity of the white race. And we know we don't share the history of whiteness and white supremacy and the legacy of colonialism and racism in Europe and the Americas. We know that's not our experience and condition. And I think as a thing that I find fascinating about being Jewish is that we don't believe in this notion of race. This is not part of our heritage. It's not part of our knowledge and our system of knowledge. The Jewish people are a nation. We're a people. And we're not distinguished based on the phenotypical features of race. In fact, The idea of race really comes about 200, 250 years ago in Europe. And of course, we know that Jewish identity and Jewish wisdom certainly predates this twisted notion of hierarchy, of defining people based on phenotypical features that are somehow inherent and create inherent characteristics of who we are as people. I'm sitting at my screen, I see Professor David Patterson, who's a scholar of many areas of with many areas of expertise, and I know he works on Emmanuel Levinas. And I'm reminded as I see David that Emmanuel Levinas, drawing on the Pirkei Avot, drawing on the ethics and the Talmud, drawing on our teachings that go back for thousands of years, we all believe as Jews that all human beings are created in the image of God. So we all have a truth, we all have wisdom within us. And our ethical obligation is to see ourselves in the face of the other, to see ourselves in the face of the other. And Levinas wrote that the moment we see ourselves in the face of the other, this is the instant we become human. So we need the other, based on Jewish ethics, to be a human being. And if we're racist or sexist, we eliminate possibilities to see the truth in other human beings, to see the godliness in other human beings that make us fuller, that make us human. So there's not this notion of Christian notion of tolerance. There's a notion of humility. And this is a Jewish idea of seeing ourselves in other human beings. And I would implore my American friends who are here listening to us, I wouldn't fight the political discourse in America and say we're not white or to say we are white. I hear crazy political comments coming out of American discourse that Sephardic Jews are not white and Ashkenazi Jews are white, and this has nothing to do with Jewish identity. This is American twisted politics of racial identities. And of course, race is important in America. We all know that there's some serious issues. But I think if I can suggest one thing that we should do as a community in face of this onslaught that is dehumanizing us and creating objects out of our history and of who we are as a people, is that we draw on our wisdom and we draw on our culture and don't get into this racialized trap of American politics. We have to assert our identity as Jewish people based on Jewish ethics and Jewish learning. And we have to, as a community, reacquaint ourselves in too many cases with this incredible living legacy of wisdom and knowledge. And if anything, the anti-Semitism shouldn't just create security forces and maybe vigilante groups fighting the thugs coming to our neighborhoods. We have to go back to the sources of our wisdom and know who we are as a people and not get sucked in to this racist, anti-racist discourse. We have to assert ourselves as Jewish people with our wisdom intact. And I think, in a very serious way, the Jewish model of identity is a wonderful solution to the racial divisions that exist in our society. And we should debunk these racist identities. I'll just say that this onslaught of dehumanizing Israel and Jewish people is significant. We know that there's three types of anti-Semitism. There was a Christian phase of anti-Semitism, the racist phase of anti-Semitism, and now the attack on who Jews are as a people. So, in the words of Robert Wistrich, anti-Semitism is a form of hatred which is inherently genocidal. Unlike other forms of discrimination and hatred, which can cause horrific damage physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, there's destructive forms of hatred which should not be minimized. But what makes anti-Semitism unique, according to Robert Wistrich, and unfortunately I agree with him, is the inherent genocidal aspect of this form of hate. So when the dominant way of perceiving reality was through the lens of religion, the Jews were the wrong religion. And the Jews, according to Christian gospel interpretations and teachings, were the wrong religion, and the Jew was blinded by evil because they couldn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. But what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that the Christians taught that until the Jew accepted the Christian notion of the Messiah, not only would the individual not have redemption, but the world could not be redeemed. So the stubborn Jew was responsible for not the messianic age and redemption coming about. So this is where the hate against Jewish people was inherently genocidal. When the dominant worldview shifted from religion to notions of race and nation, the Jews became the wrong nation, and they were poisoning the purity or threatening the purity of the white Aryan race. And this type of hatred from the protocols of the elders of Zion culminates, these lies and conspiracy theories culminates in the Holocaust. And what makes racist anti-Semitism dangerous is there's no escape. In Christian anti-Semitism, you can convert and be saved. But this racist notion that people are still peddling in is that somehow race is a fixed idea and it's inherent in our characters, and there's no, or characteristics, and there's no escape. You're born into the race and you die as a member of that race. You can't convert. Now, in universities and in the BBC and the media of record, those type of anti-Semitism in these sort of liberal postmodern spaces are not accepted. In fact, I would say that good progressive intellectuals are fighting the war of 80 years ago on behalf of the Jewish people, and they're fighting fascism. Now, unfortunately, according to these progressive intellectuals, Edward Said and his disciples in gender studies and critical race theory studies have now come to the view that the Jew is the Nazi and the Jew is the racist, and we've become the enemy of civilization. So the attack isn't the old forms of racism and fascism or Christianity, at least in the university. These other forms of anti-Semitism are having a comeback in different sectors and different demographics of our society, but not in the university. In the university, thanks to this postmodern, anti-colonial, critical Orientalist, critical race theory perspective, Israel is now the epitome of colonialism and racism and apartheid. So if this is the case, the Jew, the Israeli, the Jewish notions of peoplehood are the enemy of civilization and of postmodern enlightenment. And by an extension, Jews going to synagogue in Europe and North America have an affiliation to this racist apartheid colonial entity, and young students and faculty members operating in these postmodern liberal spaces with their connections to the Zionist, racist, apartheid entity become problems in these spaces, in these liberal spaces in Western countries. And this type of anti-Semitism, unlike the two earlier ones that I mentioned, are not only socially acceptable, but it's a form of anti-Semitism that is being propagated and encouraged. And there's tremendous pressure on faculty and Jewish students and Jewish faculty to accept this emerging dominant perspective. Otherwise, you're not accepted in the academy. You're not accepted. You don't get into class. You don't get into graduate school. You don't become a professor. You don't get tenure. You are a problem because you're racist. And I'll just tell you recently, we're trying to do work here in Oxford University, and I met a professor of human rights, a South African professor of human rights, and she's running a human rights law center. And we wanted to do some work in the law center on human rights and anti-Semitism. And she told me that she spent most of her life trying to convince the African National Congress and those fighting the apartheid racist system in South Africa that not all white people were part of the apartheid system, and that there were white people who were not racist and didn't buy into the system, and that they should be part of this liberation struggle for a new free South Africa. And then she went on to tell me that there's no place for our work in a human rights center. And she then informed me, she instructed me that my work, my life's work, should not be fighting the 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 symptoms of anti-Semitism, but I need to fight the cause of anti-Semitism. And what's the cause of anti-Semitism? My responsibility, she told me, is to disentangle the connection that the Jewish people have to Israel in order to end anti-Semitism, and that this project will be infinitely more difficult as a Jewish intellectual than it was for her as a white South African intellectual. And that was the end of our conversation. So extraordinary. So this is what is being peddled in schools. And we have to remember, in Oxbridge and the Ivy Leagues, Jews were not permitted because they were the wrong religion. These universities were set up by churches, in fact. Jews were not accepted because they were an inferior race. There was no space for them, and perhaps there were some quotas. And the anti-Semitism that was being taught in these universities during these periods are well known and historic. But today they would never exclude us for being the wrong religion or the wrong race, but they will exclude us and they will fight against us because we have the wrong sense of what it is to be part of a people. And this anti-Semitism is not only alive and well, but it's being encouraged. And I think my last point before I go on, and I'll just end with one more thought, is again, our community needs to be aware that universities are the foundation of our society, and our community needs to wake up. And this is a war that's not going to be won in a social media news cycle or in a month, or we're not going to plan a big demonstration and that's going to be the end of it. It's going to take a generation at least to create research centers, to create courses and departments dealing with this oldest scourge of hatred. And it's going to take a generation to train people. We're not training people. There's centers on racism, as there should be. There's centers on gender studies, as there should be. And there's been advances on issues of racism and sexism. There's centers on queer studies, as there should be. And there's been advances in the struggle against homophobia. But there are not centers that are dealing with these issues in a serious way. There's one or two centers that are doing good work. They're small, but they're good. But there's most of the research centers on anti-Semitism are actually blaming Israel and Jewish people for anti-Semitism. It's extraordinary. And I'll just end with one note, and I said this the other day. When I was a student at McGill University, I took a class with Sam Newmoff, and he spoke about South Africa. And I had just come back from the Soviet Union meeting the Jewish refuseniks. I was involved in Hillel and the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. I was involved in helping bring Ethiopian Jews to Canada before they were able to get to freedom in Israel. And he gave a class on apartheid South Africa. And I went up to him after class. I was a naive kid. I was 19 years old. And I asked the professor, this was 1986. I said, when did apartheid end? And he laughed. And he said, apartheid still exists. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe that in my lifetime, the grandson of refugees from Europe, that this ideology of racism and fascism and Nazism was still existing in Southern Africa. I was shocked. And to make a long story short, I became active in the anti-apartheid movement. I became the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada. I was involved in creating pre-negotiations between the ANC and even the PAC and the white regime. And I was very active. I went to South Africa at the invitation of the ANC to be an observer, to help them. And I did it because I was a human rights activist. I believed in social democracy, social democracy. And I believed at the time that the African National Congress and the anti-apartheid movement was a wide umbrella organization of all sorts of groups and ideologies and religions fighting the racist regime, the apartheid regime. So as a liberal, social democratic Canadian Jewish kid, I was honored and happy to be part of the struggle. And I learned a lot, and it was incredible. But now, Israel's the apartheid state, right? So imagine the progressive intellectuals are going to help who? They're going to help Hamas. Hamas. Hamas, if you please read the covenant. It's on, you can get it in English, will take you 10 minutes. If anybody from Hamas submitted the covenant to me in my class as a teacher, I would fail them for plagiarism. They plagiarized the protocols of the elders of Zion. They take the protocols of the elders of Zion, and as Elie Wiesel taught, the Holocaust didn't happen or didn't begin with the crematoriums and the railroad tracks. They began with words and they began with ideas. And the words and ideas of the protocols of the elders of Zion was the foundational element of anti-Semitism, of fascism, of Nazism. It was the foundation of the extermination of the Jewish people. And Hamas has this stolen, lifted, plagiarized in their constitution, in their raison d'etre. It's not the military wing, it's not the extreme wing, it's Hamas. And Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood calls for the extermination of Jews. Yosef Kawadawi, who helped to start Islamic studies, I'm in Oxford, down the road, always said, consistently said, that the true believer is obligated to finish the work of Hitler. This is the individual on the founding member of the Board of Trustees of Oxford Islamic Studies Center here. And the permeation of the Muslim Brotherhood and its ideology in Western universities is a whole other issue that needs to be explored. And it is being explored, uncovered. But imagine progressive, postmodern, anti-racists are actually supporting Hamas, who calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people and the destruction of Israel. But let's leave the anti-Semitism to the side for a moment. Women are subjugated. A woman cannot leave their home without the permission of a male adult member of a family. Gay people are murdered. Opposition to them are summarily executed. They don't believe in citizenship. They don't believe in democracy. So how is it such highly educated people and intelligent people are putting their support to a reactionary, genocidal, anti-democratic, sexist, homophobic movement when intelligent people are so deeply irrational, you know that there's something deeply wrong. And this is what has permeated our universities. This is what's permeated the fact that the New York Times could do what they do, or the BBC can say what they say. And this is our discourse. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious problem. It's a serious challenge. And we have to approach this. On the one hand, we have to defend our security and our safety. And on the other hand, I think we have to go back to our culture and history and learn to define ourselves for who we are, and discuss and debate and explore and study who we are and what are the ethics and what are the morals of that are the foundation of who we are, and not to be defined by other people who know nothing about our history and know nothing about our culture. Israel is a colonial entity. Israel was reestablished. It wasn't established. It was reestablished. And the Romans was one of the first places that they colonized. So this history and this legacy of perceiving Israel goes deep, and we are being defined by people who don't even bother to take the time to know who we are and what our history is and what our culture is and what our knowledge is. But we must take the time to reacquaint ourselves and learn about who we are, defend ourselves, and I think at some level also have an impact in university. Go to the battle of ideas and fight there, because when the university is lost, as I believe it is, the impact that this has on policy, on discourse is profound. And it's not going to end with tweets, and it's not going to end with nice websites, and it's not going to end with op-eds, and it's not going to end with protests. So the challenge is great. So I went on a bit longer than I anticipated, but I'll be happy to take comments, questions, criticisms. Feel free. So thank you for listening.
You can put questions in the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand and we can bring you forward. See a few people. All right. Stephen, if you want to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Small, for your courageous work on behalf of this movement. And I would just like to say, it's kind of a statement. As we all know, anti-Semitism is as old as recorded history. I'm sure we have all had experienced some form of anti-Semitism in our personal life. I, as a youngster, grew up in the Catholic part of town, and back then, as early as the 60s, Catholics were taught in catechism that the Jews killed Christ. So I was berated on a regular basis, actually jumped on and yelled at, "Why did you kill Christ? Why did you kill Christ?" And you know, I remember once coming home and asking my mom experience, and she said, "You tell them that you had a cousin at Pearl Harbor that died to defend the likes of them." And I didn't understand, but what I think she was saying was that freedom is for all people, and the right to not suffer from persecution for any race, religion, creed, whatever, is a right. And I would just like to say it's very scary that how it's been accepted in our public, our elected leaders, the squad specifically. I mean, can you, I remember Congressman, I believe it was Tlaib, said the Holocaust gave her a warm feeling inside. And can you imagine if an elected servant said, well, lynching of Black people gives me a warm feeling inside? I'm just making comparisons, and it's just very upsetting to me as a Jew to experience all this. And I would like to, I think we need grassroots activism, sending petitions to Congress in whatever way for our Jewish elected officials to censor, or any elected officials. And thank you again. Thank you for all the work of
Thank you.
this
Thank you.
organization, and Dr. Small for your courageous work. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So and I'll just say I know you're a musician, and I think music can play a big role in all of this healing, but that's a whole other issue. Um, no, thank you for your comments, and I think what you said makes is important. The fact that members of the Democratic Party of the United States of America can say what they've been saying, that Israel's an apartheid state, that Jews are, the list goes on, the consistent anti-Semitic statements by members of the Democratic Party in Congress and Senate is reflective of the ideas that are emanating from universities. And you're right, Stephen. If if those words were said by any other group, they would be across the board uproar, and those members of the Democratic Party would be removed from their party. And the fact that you speak about a grassroots movement, the fact that our community has remained largely silent on these issues, I find astounding. And I think it just goes to the point how this anti Semitism has creeped from the universities, from important intellectuals, into our media and now into our policy discourse. And it's legitimate. It's legitimate. And I think what the last few weeks has shown us how legitimate it is. And and I think I won't go into all the details, but it's interesting how the Iranian revolutionary regime, which is committed to the extermination of Israel and the Jewish people, controls Hamas and Hezbollah, and Qatar of the Muslim Brotherhood is paying for these military campaigns. So there's forces at work right under our noses that I think we need to take a close look at. So thank you, Stephen. Professor Asher Matthias, I see your hand's been up for a while. Feel free to ask a question, please.
I have been following you for a number of months now, and they're wonderful, wonderful lectures and discussions. I just want, as a liberal, moderate, progressive Republican who crossed the aisle in 1964 to vote for LBJ and haven't voted yet for a Republican president, I must caution that the wonderful statement by our new and better president over saying that we would have peace in the region when the obvious takes place, and that is the neighbors must accept the existence and the thriving of a Jewish entity there. So that's one thing. The other, you mentioned Martin Luther King, of course, and wonderful statement that he's quoted often in annual commemorations of his birthday, is that anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. So I have taken it as a survivor of the Greek Holocaust, being born in a cave and escaping the Nazis. I have personally taken it upon myself to confront Greek anti-Semites by asking a simple question: are you a Zionist? Because they still persist in thinking of this as some kind of conspiracy, as you cited the Elders of Zion. That is being a bestseller in the Athenian Agora today. So it's not a conspiracy. I say it's simply agreement that we must, that you support the existence of a Jewish state. So it's amazing. Greece, as I mentioned in the past, also was the only European and Christian country to vote against the establishment of the state of Israel. So in 1947, a resolution went in. So all of that is a gestalt. You have to attack our silence of among our friends, even though Greece is now in the best of situation with Israel. But deep down, the public is still ignorant. They don't have Holocaust studies. They don't observe. They don't march on the March of the Living. And so many. I'm picking on Greece, of course, because of my background, but that can be applied to the ignorance, intolerance, and bigotry that is so wide in our country and the world. But I'm very hopeful. I'm not scared of the two Muslim women. As I mentioned in the past, they are exposed to 30 House members, colleagues who are Jewish, and 13 Jewish senators. By the process of acculturation and coming together for legislation, they would be exposed. They would learn. If they don't, they would become ineffective, and they would be run out of their seats by their own people. So
Yeah.
I know that you are in London and there in Oxford, and the new rabid anti-Semitism of Cornyn and the Labour Party you live with. So maybe that has influenced perhaps some of the perceptions about the Democratic Party. It is in my party, but I would stand up and say that the Democratic Party is still the main center is holding, and it is absolutely with the state of Israel and with Zionism. That's
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you for your comments. So, just to respond to you and to Stephen, I grew up in Quebec, so I'm acquainted with the Catholic forms of anti-Semitism, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was significantly Greek. And I think the first Greek word I learned was vreos, as we were being chased through our neighborhood. But I digress. I think we should not underestimate our enemies. And I think one of the problems that we have in our community is that we don't understand the forms of anti-Semitism that's attacking us. And to think that our enemies don't have a coherent mission, that they don't have a coherent ideology or a worldview or objectives, I think is unfortunately naive, and we cannot be naive. We have to study the minds of our enemies. We have to study the minds of our enemies, and we have to know their ideology, their language, and what they're trying to achieve. And some of the Congress, members of Congress of the Democratic Party are very much connected. Ilhan Omar is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's plain and simple. She was an honored guest at CARE, at their annual dinner. She was the keynote speaker. And CARE is the front of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States of America. And we have to respect our enemies and respect them enough to understand what they're trying to achieve. And CARE and Ilhan Omar and others in the squad are connected and committed to an agenda. And I don't think that through meeting other like-minded people or colleagues in Congress, I'm sure they're very polite and nice to them, but they're not going to shift their ideology as we wouldn't shift our ideology. So we have to know our enemy. And I just see Carol in the comments. I just wanted to mention there was a wonderful article by Elisha Wiesel, the son of Eli Wiesel, that I urge you to read, and she posted it in the chat. And it's an amazing article about the silence of the Jewish people, and he's invoking the memory and the teachings of his father, Professor Wiesel. It's an important article. And hello, Carol. I see Jack Berkowitz has his hand up.
Hi, Dr. Small.
Also, if other people have questions, if you raise your hand, it's easy to see.
I have two questions, if I may. The first one is with respect to the virulent anti-Semitism on campus. Do you believe it's time that the organized Jewish community start compiling listings and databases and ranking colleges and universities throughout the US and Canada on those that are worst to best, and making recommendations to parents on which schools to avoid and which schools to prioritize on a going forward basis? And is this something that the organized Jewish community would even consider? The second question, and I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but a couple of weeks ago, at the onset of the violence, the hostilities, the war in Israel, Ambassador Ron Dermer made a very intriguing comment that perhaps it's time that the American Jewish community and Israel start paying more attention and prioritizing the evangelical community in the US because of their support of Israel, rather than the secular Jewish community, which is at times adversarial at the very least to Israel. What do you think of that comment?
Yeah, thanks. So two important issues. So the first one with ranking the universities, I think it's a good idea. If I were sending my kids to school, I'd want to know what kind of environment they're going to. So that could be helpful. And for the immediate future, maybe it's a good ranking to have, and maybe it could put some pressure on some universities to get their house in order if they're ranked poorly. But I think that this crisis goes deeper, because this crisis is not just the atmosphere on campus, and rather, whether Students for Justice in Palestine or some progressive white kids or the Black Lives Matter movement is putting up apartheid walls and things of that nature that makes students feel terrible, whether Jewish kids are getting eviction notices like the Palestinians do, they get eviction notices in their dorms, and some universities allow these things to kind of go unchecked. So yeah, I think it would be good to rank the universities, and it's helpful. But I think that we have to understand that the rot, the anti-Semitism, has been incorporated into the classroom. It's in the classroom. It's at the finest universities in the curriculum. The professors are teaching their students to read certain books in a positive way, and to read other texts in a negative way. Um, Dozens of gender studies research centers in the United States, at the best, at Yale, at University of Chicago, came out with a statement that Israel is an apartheid racist state. Now, as insane as that is, as it is insulting to South Africans. And by the way, this is a very important issue. The hijacking of South African history by radical Muslims in South Africa and communists in South Africa with the help of the Muslim Brotherhood is ingenious. And our community refuses to engage in this space in South Africa. The fact that the Muslim Brotherhood and people who want to destroy Israel have usurped the history of a people that have suffered under apartheid and use it for their own advantage, and switch the struggle from a progressive social democratic struggle to a struggle of extermination and of anti-democracy. The fact that we're not engaged in trying to expose the hijacking of this, and have allowed it to enter into North America and Europe and our universities, is astounding. It's insulting to South Africans that experienced apartheid, and it's insulting to Jewish people given our history. But I digress. But I think that the real struggle is to win back the battle of ideas. And if we don't show up at that battlefield, and essentially we're not there yet, it's just inevitable that it's going to get worse. So I have mixed feelings about the rankings and its impact. But I guess for an immediate concern for where your children or grandchildren are going, it could be important. And what Ron Dermer said, I have issues with this. First of all, there's been studies that are showing that even among the evangelical community, particularly among young evangelicals, that anti-Semitism is returning and the perception of Israel is shifting in a negative way. That's first. Secondly, I have a real issue with allying myself with somebody who thinks I'm going to hell. Um, I think that that coalition is fraught with problems. And if people cannot see each other as fully human, there's a problem. And I think that alliance won't last for all sorts of reasons. But that's my view of that. And I think I would go back. I think the fact that what Ron Dermer said, he does point to some serious issues within particularly in the American Jewish community, the level of assimilation, the level of just a profound lack of understanding of who we are as a people. I was brought up in Montreal, so maybe Canadian Jews, or especially Jews in Quebec, maybe we're 2 or 3 generations behind the American Jewish community in terms of assimilation for all sorts of reasons. Canada is a society based on multiculturalism where there's an emphasis on group identity. The United States, for better or for worse, has this ethos of the melting pot. So it's different. But I am still astounded and regularly shocked by the lack of knowledge within the Jewish community. The level of assimilation is profound. And I think that if we're going to fight back effectively, at some level, the American Jewish community, particularly young people, really have to learn about who they are and to take pride in this incredible heritage that we have. And I think that to me is more important than making some sort of political alliance with the evangelicals. But thank you for your questions. And would anybody else like to put up their hand with a question? Catherine, I see your hand.
I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I had my camera switched off.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Charles. I
Thanks.
completely agree with you that this requires a kind of a sea change in how to educate and how to tackle this. But is there a suggestion you have for us all sitting here now today, one thing we could do to take action right now? And I know that's a really hard question.
So, so we're involved, Catherine's a research scholar and an active research scholar with ISGAP. So, at the very least, what we could do now, I think that the Jewish community, leaders in the community, leading philanthropists, leading organizations should help faculty and students kick down the doors in academia. And I don't mean, Stand With Us and Hillel and all. We're supporting the kids, which is wonderful. And we should continue to support the kids and increase our support of the kids. And they need help and support. But the community has to wake up and realize that universities are the foundation of our society. It's not social media. It's not technology. It's not tweeting. It's the university. And if we don't show up in the university, in the classroom, we're sunk. So I would say that our community, leaders in the community, should partner with scholars all over North America and all over Europe and go to the universities just like the Muslim Brotherhood did. The Muslim Brotherhood, we know, gave $6.8 billion to American universities. That was undisclosed, and it's probably much higher. We know it's much higher. So if our enemies could be funding the Edward Saids of the world and the research centers and Middle East studies and shift the way people see reality and turn it upside down, I think we should learn from our enemies. And the leaders of the Jewish community must kick the doors of academia open and bring with them bright young scholars who can teach the next generation in an honest, truthful manner. And until that happens, we can have tweeting parties and we can have Zoom parties and we can have demonstrations on campus, and it's all very good. It's a part of the ecosystem of this war against anti-Semitism. But until there's a serious effort to respect the power of ideas and the power of education and the power of knowledge, Catherine, there's nothing else to do other than join Sahel and fight against this onslaught. That's how I see it. So yes, we need to organize academic programs all over the Western world and research centers to expose the deep-seated reemergence of anti-Semitism and to map it, decode it, help to create curriculum, create policies that will deal with it. And as Elie Wiesel always taught, anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. We're the early warning system for the health of democratic societies. And this is it's not a parochial Jewish Israeli problem. It's a problem for democratic societies and the future of democracy. Thank you. Professor Nussbaum, I see your hand, and then Greg. Thanks, Catherine. David, can you hear us?
Okay. Hi,
Hi.
Charles. Thank you very much. I agree with.
I hear you well. I hear you.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think that what is going on today is part of a general global push to get rid of democracy as we know it. The woke pseudo philosophy, the attack on truth, the attack on reality. When the medical school at the University of British Columbia, which is probably one of the top 3 or 4 universities in Canada, is teaching that females can have penises and men can menstruate and give birth and things like that. I mean, this is obvious nonsense. And what the strategy is to replace intellectualism with emotionalism, to undo the Enlightenment. And that is what is driving this whole thing. So anti-Semitism, of course, affects us first. And I agree that it starts with the Jews, but never ends with the Jews, because people who have these anti-human values, they are not content with exerting power over Jews, but they want to exert power over the whole world. And so we have 2 entities today, the radical Islam and the so-called progressive or global communist movement. They both want to rule the whole world and dominate. And with both of them, the other, defined either religiously or ideologically, is of no consequence at all. And both of them have horrific histories of mass murder. So I think that we have to appreciate the context that has put the sort of green-red alliance together, because their only common goal, if you look at their ideologies, they're diametrically opposed, whether it is, atheism versus religiosity. They're 180 degrees at the opposite ends of that spectrum. The place of women in society, the treatment of gays, economic disparity. Islam has never had a problem with that. And we are told that this is one of the goals of the left, which, by the way, really isn't true. But that is the hook to get people to believe the nonsense. So they both want to dominate the globe. The major obstacle to them was a successful democratic West, not a perfect West. The West has its flaws, capitalism has its flaws, but it is so much better than the alternatives. And there is no concession of that in the cancel culture, which is entirely based on removing any positive aspect that can contribute to positive Western identity or positive Jewish identity, but this is the context for what's going on. And I know that this is not going to be popular amongst those of even of us who take a more left-wing approach, but that's the reality. So if anybody wants to debate it, I'll be happy to debate it, but I'm not sure that this is the forum for such a debate.
No, thank you, David. I agree. I mean, even the notion of truth, of good and evil, once you start speaking in these terms, you're on the wrong side, the wrong philosophical side of the equation. Yeah, so I think what you're saying, I agree with what you're saying. It's important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So, Greg Mashberg, we have about 10 more minutes. Greg.
Thanks, Charles. One of the most painful things to me is the position taken by many in the reformed and conservative Jewish movements with respect to Israel and Jewish peoplehood, ranging from hostility towards indifference, towards an academic standing above the fray in an effort to seem even-handed and analytical. My question is there or should there be any effort to talk about the kind of things that you're talking about in the university settings, in the seminaries, in the to rabbinical students, to cantorial students? Could you address that?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's a very important subject. You know, when you go back to the civil rights movement and the struggle for Soviet Jewry, the rabbis in North America played a significant role. And I'm sad to say that their presence is not really felt in the struggle against anti-Semitism in the contemporary context. So yes, I think there's a very important void that needs to be filled. And it would be wonderful if rabbis, individual rabbis, and different movements within the Jewish community, rabbinical movements and schools and organizations became more active. I think it would be extraordinarily important. And then I think, having said that, I think that there are issues in some of the Jewish movements that need to be addressed. And you know, you talk about postmodernity. You know, for Jews, I dare say, there's Jerusalem, and there's one Jerusalem, and there's a physical Jerusalem, and there's a spiritual Jerusalem, but it's one physical place that we can go to, or maybe some of us are there now. And this notion in the United States of America that you can build Jerusalem in Chicago or in Beverly Hills or whatever it is, talk about postmodern thought. And I think that's very destructive. You know, if I may, I grew up in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Montreal, and I learned there's Israel and Jerusalem, and to be a free Jew, you have to be connected to the land. I think if we lose that and we assimilate our ideas to integrate or assimilate to such an extent, it's damaging. And I mean, that's my view. I think Judaism is very clear on what Israel is, on what Jerusalem is, on what it means to be free. And if we hollow out everything to fit into the conditions that we're in, it becomes problematic at so many levels. I don't know. So these are deep questions, Greg, and I hope our community will be able to, in light of the shifting sands, particularly in the United States. I think in places like Canada and Europe, people are more attuned to what anti-Semitism is, and I think this is hitting the American Jewish community in a way that's a bit shocking to them. And I think that there has to be some soul searching of what kind of society the United States is. How deep is this anti-Semitism? I would call it institutionalized anti-Semitism that goes deep. And how does the community respond? And how do different branches of Judaism respond to this, these challenging times? I think we have to look inwards to some extent and be creative and to reinstill a sense of pride and attune ourselves to the situation based on our understanding of our heritage and our living culture. Important question. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? We have a few minutes left.
Looks like Georgette has her
Okay, Georgette.
hand up.
Bonjour. Ça va? Merci.
Yes, I just learned this morning in Israel politically what's happening, and Bibi seems to be on his way out, and unfortunately Bennett and Yair Lapid are coming in with the accord of the Arab representative at the Knesset. Is that letting the wolf in the sheep's area? Is there any good that can come out of it? Or are we being blind again because they're not going to change their mind? I mean, they're led by, we know very well, Shaya and the Muslim Brothers and the rest. So this is just another trick. They're biting for it. They're going in for it. What?
Yeah.
Anything good can come out of that?
So I find it for somebody studying anti-Semitism and the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that it's not just Israeli Palestinians or Muslims, it's the Muslim Brotherhood is now in the government of the new Israeli coalition. So yeah, I find that extraordinarily problematic as somebody studying anti-Semitism, because this is an anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, sexist, homophobic movement. So it's problematic. On the other hand, it's not on the other hand, in addition to this, it's interesting that some were arguing that Hamas launched the war with Israel because they did not want Israeli Palestinians to be involved in the government. And now now Israeli Arabs are in the government, and maybe some good can come of it. But I find it very difficult to see it, and I hope it's not legitimizing the Brotherhood in any way when they should be exposed and attacked. So it's it's problematic.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to have your take on it.
Yeah.
You're positioned in a place where you can see better than we can sometimes.
I don't know. Yeah, it's an important question.
It's I feel it's dangerous. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? One last question. We have a few minutes. No? Ira, you don't see anybody? No. Okay. So I'll leave it there. And so thank you very much for joining me, for this 90 minutes. I appreciate your time. And everybody stay well and strong. And, a lot of our work at ISGAP is online now. We have courses coming up. We have an excellent course with a professor of physics at Oxford with Richard Landis. It's starting, I believe, on June the 7th. We have an online course. We do a summer program at Oxford University, and we recorded some of the best professors that we host, and we put together an online course with literally, I'm not exaggerating, with literally the best scholars on anti-Semitism online, and you can register, and you take each class, and you can take a quiz at the end of the class, and you get a certificate at the end. So we have live courses, we have pre-recorded courses, and we have the Summer Institute that you're welcome to take online. So you can engage a lot of these important issues from really the leading experts in the world on it. So please visit our website at www.isgap.org, and we have free articles, free books, and all these online courses that are at your disposal. So thank you very much, and be well, and have a good Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.